Death has always been humanity's deepest riddle. For millennia, every culture has wondered where we go when the final breath leaves the body. Do we rise toward a higher plane, return again in another form, or dissolve into silence? Most traditions agree that something, some essence, some spark survives beyond the flesh. But what if that spark was never there to begin with? What if a person lived their entire life hollow inside, mimicking the gestures of love, echoing the words of faith, but never carrying the inner flame we call the soul? It is an unsettling thought, one most of us prefer not to touch. After all, we expect death to be a passage, a threshold to something greater. But if the being crossing that threshold has no true soul, what becomes of them? Do they drift into nothingness, their existence erased like a chalk drawing in the rain? Do they fragment into energies that recycle through the universe yet never retain identity? Or do they linger, shadows without roots, tethered to the living in ways we can barely perceive? This question is not meant to inspire fear, but rather clarity. For those walking a spiritual path, understanding the fate of the soulless forces us to turn inward. It reminds us that the work of the soul is not automatic, not guaranteed, simply because we are born human. As Carl Jung suggested, many live entire lives without ever meeting their own soul. Edgar Cayce warned that some incarnations walk the earth as sleeping souls, never fully awakened. The Gnostics whispered about empty vessels manipulated by forces beyond their own awareness. And modern psychology, in its own language, has described people so emotionally barren that they function more like patterns than persons. So we arrive at the haunting question: what happens when such beings die? The answer matters not out of morbid curiosity, but because it sharpens our own responsibility. If death reveals the truth of the soul, then life is the one arena where we shape that truth. Whether soullessness is an accident of incarnation, a refusal of growth, or a mystery we cannot yet fully measure, the implications are profound. To explore what happens beyond death for these hollow lives is, in fact, to explore what it means to truly live. Before we can ask what happens to the soulless at the moment of death, we must first face the more difficult question. What do we mean when we call someone soulless? The phrase carries a weight that feels both ancient and modern. It is whispered in myth, echoed in psychology, and hinted at in spiritual teachings across cultures. Yet the true meaning slips like water through the fingers, difficult to define, but impossible to ignore once you have encountered it. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who spent his life exploring the depths of the psyche, often described a peculiar absence he observed in certain people. He did not always use the word soulless, but he spoke of those who never seemed to touch the deeper layers of their own being. To Jung, the soul was not a religious dogma, but the living center of meaning, the bridge between the conscious ego and the vast collective unconscious. Those who never make contact with this inner reality remain trapped in a shallow existence. He sometimes spoke of the hollow man, a figure who wears masks so perfectly that even they begin to believe in the performance. Yet, behind the mask there is only emptiness. Such people can be charming, intelligent, even socially successful, but their lives recycle the same patterns without depth or transformation. This insight resonates with what many of us feel when we meet someone whose eyes seem strangely vacant. They may laugh at the right time, offer all the correct words, but something in their presence feels mechanical. Jung would argue that this psychic emptiness is not merely a lack of personality. It is the absence of connection to the archetypal source, the deep well from which true growth and individuality spring. Without that bridge, a human being can live decades in a loop, functioning outwardly while inwardly stagnant. Edgar Cayce, the American mystic known as the sleeping prophet, approached the same phenomenon from another angle. In his trance readings, Cayce claimed that not every body walking the earth was animated by an awakened soul. Some, he suggested, were inhabited only by a kind of spirit consciousness, a fragment of life energy that kept the body moving but never carried the eternal spark. He referred to these as soulless incarnations, describing them not with malice but with a kind of clinical detachment, as though noting a natural variation in the spectrum of human existence. For Cayce, the soul was eternal and chose to incarnate for the sake of growth and learning. But in rare cases, he warned, there were beings whose incarnation did not include that eternal spark. What remained was a life without the possibility of true evolution. Such claims may sound shocking, but they mirror ideas found in esoteric traditions worldwide. And they found an unlikely echo in the work of Ingo Swann, the psychic and remote viewer whose experiments with consciousness challenged the boundaries of science. Swann wrote about encountering intelligences that were not human in the ordinary sense. Conscious, yes, but not carrying the qualities we associate with soul. He described some forms of awareness as flat, machine-like, and non-evolving. These experiences raised questions not only about extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings, but also about whether some human beings might reflect a similar condition, animated, but lacking the radiance of depth. Modern psychology has attempted to describe the same phenomenon in its own vocabulary. Clinical terms such as sociopathy, psychopathy, or narcissistic personality disorder often depict people who lack empathy, remorse, or the capacity for genuine intimacy. To meet such individuals is to feel drained, manipulated, or treated as an object rather than a fellow human being. Yet psychology, rooted in the materialist worldview, stops short of calling this soullessness. It frames these conditions as mental or developmental disorders, abnormalities of the brain or personality. Spiritual traditions, however, speak in more sweeping terms. They see such emptiness not merely as dysfunction, but as strong emphasis, the absence of the soul's light. It is in the space between these two perspectives, scientific caution and spiritual boldness, that the concept of soullessness becomes most provocative. Perhaps both are describing the same reality from different sides of the veil. The psychologist sees a person with no capacity for growth, locked in patterns that never change. The mystic sees an empty vessel, a body without the eternal traveler. In both cases, the encounter leaves us shaken because strong, it challenges our deepest assumption that everyone we meet shares the same inner flame. And this is where the urgency of our exploration takes root. If some walk the earth without soul, then what does that mean for the journey beyond death? Do they dissolve into nothing, as Cayce suggested, never carrying forward the lessons of life? Do they remain in psychic fragments, as Jung might imply, never forming a cohesive archetypal presence in the collective unconscious? Or are they recycled into energies that return to the pool of existence without memory, without identity? To move closer to an answer, we must widen our lens. Across the ancient world, from the Gnostics to the Buddhists, from Christian mystics to indigenous shamans, there are stories of beings who appear human but lack the soul's flame. These traditions offer hauntingly consistent hints about what may await such beings at the threshold of death. And so, with careful steps, we turn now from psychology and modern mysticism toward the voices of the ancients, who dared to speak of the empty ones long before our age. If Jung and Cayce gave us a modern psychological and mystical language for the soulless, the ancients gave us something even more haunting. Stories. These stories were not meant as idle myths, but as maps of spiritual terrain, warnings whispered across generations about what it means to live and die without the soul's fire. When we place these traditions side by side, a strange harmony emerges, as though humanity across time has been staring at the same shadow through different windows. The Gnostics, early Christian mystics who sought hidden wisdom, spoke often of the archons, cosmic parasites feeding on human ignorance. According to their texts, the archons manipulated empty vessels, people who looked human but lacked the divine spark, the pneuma. These vessels were seen as instruments of control, agents through which the archons drained light from the world. To the Gnostics, the soulless were not villains in the theatrical sense, but pawns, bodies without sovereignty. Their fate after death was grim. Without the inner flame, they could not ascend through the celestial realms. Instead, they dissolved back into the lower densities, recycled as fodder for forces that thrive on unconsciousness. In these ancient writings, one can almost hear the echo of our own unease today when we meet someone whose presence feels more like an imitation than a life. Across the East, a parallel image emerges. In Buddhist and Hindu cosmology, there are beings known as pretas, or hungry ghosts. These entities are depicted with enormous bellies and thin, needle-like throats, forever craving yet never satisfied. While pretas are often portrayed as postmortem states of those consumed by greed or addiction, they also represent a life devoid of spiritual progress. To live without cultivating compassion, wisdom, or awareness is to risk becoming a hungry ghost after death, an existence marked not by growth but by endless repetition of craving. In a sense, the preta is a mirror of the soulless, a being animated but without the nourishment of soul, condemned to circles of longing that never resolve. Hindu philosophy adds another layer. The Atman, or soul, is understood as eternal, but not all beings are equally connected to it. Some live as if asleep, barely touching the deeper currents of existence. Scriptures warn that those who fail to awaken may find themselves caught in the cycles of rebirth without advancement, drifting through incarnations like passengers who never disembark. In this lens, soullessness is not necessarily permanent damnation, but strong emphasis, a profound stagnation. Death does not liberate such a being, it simply resets the cycle, offering another chance that may or may not be seized. Christian mysticism, though cloaked in different language, tells a similar story. Medieval mystics wrote of the living dead, souls so bound by sin, apathy, or spiritual blindness that they were as good as lifeless, even while breathing. The Bible itself offers the chilling phrase, "Let the dead bury their own dead," Matthew 8:22, suggesting that one can be biologically alive but spiritually extinguished. For these mystics, the fate of such beings after death was not entry into the divine presence, but separation, a return to the void of nothingness, or in harsher interpretations, the torments of hell. Yet even here, the emphasis was not on punishment but on absence. The living dead were already hollow. Death merely confirmed what life had revealed. Among indigenous traditions, the language grows more visceral. Many First Nations peoples of North America tell of spirits with no light in their chest. These beings wander without guidance, feared not for their malice, but for their emptiness. In some Amazonian tribes, shamans speak of false men created by sorcery, human forms animated but missing the sacred essence, dangerous because they echo humanity without truly being it. African cosmologies, too, describe spirits that hover at the edge of community, neither fully alive nor fully ancestral, because they lacked the moral or spiritual depth to cross into the realm of honored ancestors. Such beings are remembered as warnings. To live without cultivating spirit is to die without leaving a trace. What strikes us as we gather these voices across continents is not their difference, but their eerie agreement. Whether in Gnostic Greece, Buddhist India, Christian Europe, or indigenous forests, humanity has wrestled with the same intuition. Some beings live without soul, and death for them does not open into eternity, but into dissolution, stagnation, or wandering. This recognition forces us into uncomfortable reflection. If so many traditions independently named this condition, then perhaps it is more than superstition. Perhaps they were recording, in their own symbolic languages, encounters with the same phenomenon we today describe as soullessness. And if they were right, then the question becomes even sharper. What does it mean for us to live with soul to make sure we do not fall into the same fate? These ancient perspectives do not answer the mystery completely, but they form a foundation, a chorus of warnings from across time. To move further, we must now turn to what science and philosophy can contribute. While their language is more cautious, modern thinkers like Einstein, neuroscientists, and philosophers of mind have also hinted consciousness without depth may be a kind of illusion. Could science, too, be circling around the same truth the ancients already knew? If the ancients left us myth and symbol, science offers us language of measurement and theory. Yet, strangely, when modern thinkers probe the nature of consciousness, they often arrive at conclusions that sound as haunting as the Gnostic whispers or Buddhist parables we have just explored. Perhaps the worlds of spirit and science are not as far apart as they seem. Perhaps they are circling the same mystery from opposite directions. Albert Einstein, whose mind reshaped the universe with relativity, also left behind deeply spiritual reflections. He reminded us that the sense of separateness, the belief that we are isolated individuals cut off from each other and from the cosmos, is an optical delusion of consciousness. For Einstein, the true tragedy of this illusion is not simply ignorance, but confinement. It is a kind of prison, shrinking the individual into selfish concerns, cutting them off from the wider whole. His words invite us to wonder, if the illusion of separateness is already a distortion, what would it mean to live without ever touching the reality of interconnectedness? Could this be the scientific equivalent of soullessness, an existence defined entirely by the prison walls, never glimpsing the vast sky beyond? Neuroscience has joined the conversation in recent decades, and its findings deepen the riddle. Studies on brain networks have revealed that consciousness is not localized in one place, but emerges from complex patterns of activity. The default mode network, for example, lights up when we reflect on ourselves, imagine the future, or empathize with others. Damage to these regions or dysfunction in their connectivity can lead to flattened affect, loss of empathy, or a diminished sense of self. In clinical terms, this is described as neurological impairment, but on the spiritual level, it eerily mirrors descriptions of the hollow man. A being whose brain never awakens these circuits may be alive, even intelligent, yet their consciousness feels curiously mechanical, lacking growth, depth, or resonance. Consider also the science of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself through learning and experience. Humans with active, growing souls seem to thrive on this plasticity. They learn, suffer, adapt, and evolve, weaving new layers of wisdom into their lives. But what of those who show no such growth? Neuroscientists describe them as stuck in repetitive patterns, unable to break free from rigid loops of behavior. To spiritual traditions, this is the very mark of soullessness. Existence without transformation, experience without alchemy. Here, science and spirituality converge in describing the same condition, albeit through different languages. Philosophy, too, has wrestled with the question of consciousness without a soul. Materialist philosophers argue that what we call soul is nothing more than brain activity, an emergent property of neurons firing in sequence. In this view, once the body dies, consciousness ceases entirely. Yet others, from Plato to Descartes to modern thinkers, insist that consciousness cannot be reduced to matter alone. They point to the hard problem of consciousness, first articulated by philosopher David Chalmers. Why should electrical impulses in the brain give rise to subjective experience at all? Why should there be an inner eye that feels joy, sorrow, or awe, instead of merely a machine processing inputs and outputs? This debate opens the door to the unsettling possibility. Perhaps not all forms of consciousness are the same. Some may be rich with interiority, capable of reflection and moral growth, the qualities we associate with soul. Others may be shallow, functional without that inner depth. Ingo Swan's accounts of encountering machine-like intelligences fit this picture. And in our everyday lives, when we meet someone whose presence feels flat, whose actions seem scripted, we too sense the possibility that not every consciousness carries the same essence. The implications are enormous. If consciousness does not automatically equal soul, then the presence of thought, speech, or even creativity does not guarantee depth. A person could appear fully human, yet remain locked in what Einstein called the delusion of separateness, never awakening to the wider truth. Neuroscience may describe this as lack of plasticity or empathy, philosophy as a shallow stream of awareness, but spirituality names it plainly: soullessness. And so we return to our central question: what happens when such a consciousness dies? If their awareness was never connected to the greater whole, does it simply vanish like a signal lost when the machine is switched off? Or does it scatter into fragments, echoes in the collective unconscious without a center to hold them? What science teaches us is not certainty, but humility. Even with brain scans, equations, and philosophical debates, the mystery of consciousness resists final explanation. And yet, in that resistance, science unwittingly points us back to the same crossroads the ancients described. There are lives connected to the greater whole, and there are lives cut off from it. The former may find continuity beyond death, the latter may not. This tension between science and spirit does not end here. To explore it more deeply, we must now step into the threshold itself: death. Having defined the soulless and traced their echoes through myth, psychology, and neuroscience, we must now ask with courage: when the final breath leaves a soulless being, what truly happens on the other side? Few questions strike more deeply than this. When a soulless being dies, what happens next? The moment of death is, for most of us, a passage, a threshold across which the essence of who we are carries forward. Yet, if no essence exists, if life has been lived without soul, what then is left to cross over? Do they cease altogether, vanish like a candle snuffed in the wind? Do they remain earthbound, clinging like shadows to the world of the living? Or are they recycled into the raw materials of existence, stripped of identity, scattered into the cosmos as impersonal energy? Across mysticism, psychology, and esoteric traditions, several haunting interpretations emerge. Edgar Cayce, in his trance readings, often spoke of incarnations where no awakened soul was present. To him, the fate of such beings after death was stark. Without a soul's continuity, there was nothing to carry forward into the afterlife. Some, he suggested, simply ceased, their energy dissipating like a dream upon waking. Others might linger temporarily, earthbound, drawn to the familiar vibrations of the material plane, but unable to progress toward higher realms. Still others, Cayce hinted, were recycled into the stream of creation, their essence broken down and reused, much like water molecules returning to the ocean. In all of these visions, one thread remained constant. There was no continuity of self, no eternal spark carrying lessons across lifetimes. Carl Jung, though he avoided religious dogma, offered a psychological interpretation that feels chillingly close. For Jung, what survives death is not the ego, the conscious I with its daily concerns, but the deeper imprint of the soul upon the collective unconscious. A life deeply lived leaves archetypal traces, wisdom, patterns, symbols that ripple beyond the individual. But what of the hollow man, the one who never contacted soul? Jung suggested that such an ego simply dissolves, leaving no archetypal imprint behind. The memories, desires, and stories fade into nothing, like a play performed without ever touching the stage of the eternal. In this view, the soulless do not suffer punishment. They simply leave no echo, as though they had never truly lived. Esoteric traditions push this image further, describing death without soul as a kind of fragmentation. Theosophy and Hermetic writings speak of the human being as layered: physical body, astral body, mental body, and soul. When death comes, the soul normally draws the subtle bodies upward, integrating their lessons. But if no soul is present, or if it remains dormant, the astral and mental bodies cannot ascend. Instead, they disintegrate in the astral plane, becoming debris, psychic fragments that may wander temporarily as shells or ghosts. These entities, lacking a true center, can sometimes be perceived by the living as restless spirits, repeating patterns without growth. They are not immortal souls, but leftovers, echoes of life that eventually dissolve. This image resonates with traditions that warn of hungry ghosts or wandering shades. It also explains why some hauntings feel mechanical, the same footsteps, the same cries, repeated endlessly as though the being were stuck in a loop. Esoteric teachers caution that such fragments are not true souls, but energetic residues. In death without soul, nothing coherent survives. Only debris drifts for a time before dissolving completely. When we compare this with reincarnation models, the contrast becomes clear. In traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, reincarnation is not a punishment, but a process of learning. The soul carries forward tendencies, karma, and growth. Each life is a chance to evolve. But in the case of the soulless, there is nothing to reincarnate. Without a center of continuity, there is no traveler moving through lifetimes, no lessons carried from one existence to another. If reincarnation is a school, then the soulless are like shadows sitting in the classroom without ever registering for the course. When the bell rings, they vanish. Nothing advances because nothing was enrolled to begin with. Some modern mystics soften this image, suggesting that what we call soulless beings may not be permanently lost, but simply unawakened. In this gentler view, the dissolution of identity at death is not an eternal annihilation, but a reset. Their life energy is recycled into the great stream, and from that stream, a chance for awakening may emerge in future incarnations. In other words, the soul may not have been active in this life, but it could awaken in another. This interpretation offers hope without denying the stark reality of emptiness experienced in the present. What unites all these theories, from Cayce's warnings to Jung's psychology to esoteric teachings, is the absence of continuity. Where there is soul, there is survival, growth, memory across lifetimes. Where there is no soul, there is dissolution, fragmentation, or recycling. Death, in such cases, is not a doorway, but a wall. And yet, reflecting on these ideas does not leave us only with dread. It also sharpens the urgency of our own lives. If soullessness leads to dissolution, then the opposite must also be true. Living with soul, cultivating depth, growth, compassion, leads to continuity, to a presence that endures beyond death. The fate of the soulless is not only their story, it is also a mirror, showing us what we must avoid and what we must awaken. With this in mind, we are ready to take the final step of our exploration, the ethical and spiritual lessons for the living. For in asking what happens to the soulless when they die, we are really asking, what must we do to ensure our own light survives? After walking through the haunting question of what happens to soulless beings when they die, we are left not only with images of dissolution and emptiness, but with a mirror turned back on ourselves. For if it is possible to live and die without soul, then the greatest responsibility each of us carries is not to diagnose others, but to ensure that our own light burns brightly. The lesson here is not about condemnation. It is about awakening. The first step is learning the difference between discernment and judgment. Discernment is the quiet recognition of reality. It allows us to see when someone is dangerous, manipulative, or hollow without slipping into hatred. Judgment, on the other hand, hardens the heart. When we judge, we reduce another being to a caricature, and in doing so, we risk dimming our own soul. As Carl Jung warned, The shadow we project outward is often the unacknowledged part of ourselves. To demonize the soulless is to risk becoming soulless in turn, trapped in bitterness rather than awakening. True discernment asks us to see clearly, act wisely, and then release the need to condemn. This clarity becomes vital when we think about protecting our energy. Many people who encounter soulless individuals report feeling drained, confused, or diminished after spending time with them. Psychology might explain this as the effect of narcissistic behavior. Spirituality might call it vampiric energy. Whatever the language, the effect is real. If we do not protect our light, it can be quietly consumed. But here again, protection does not mean cruelty. You do not have to hate someone to step back. You do not have to attack to withdraw. Think of it like tending a sacred flame. You shield it from the wind, not because you despise the wind, but because you honor the fire. Practical steps can help. Boundaries are essential. Limit the time and energy you give to those who consistently drain you. Practices like meditation, prayer, and grounding in nature can restore balance when you feel depleted. Surrounding yourself with people who radiate authenticity and warmth can replenish what has been lost. And perhaps most importantly, cultivate compassion at a distance. Even if someone appears soulless, that does not make them your enemy. They may be caught in conditions you cannot see. Blessing them silently while stepping away is often the wisest path. Yet the heart of this chapter lies not in analyzing others, but in strengthening ourselves. If soullessness is marked by stagnation, then soulful living must be marked by growth. Ask yourself, am I evolving? Do I allow suffering to teach me? Or do I repeat the same patterns year after year? Soul strength is not measured by perfection, but by transformation. A soulful person at 70 does not look like they did at 20. Their eyes carry depth. Their presence carries resonance. Their story carries layers. Each scar has become wisdom. Each failure a seed of compassion. Albert Einstein's reminder that separateness is an illusion offers us a guiding star here. The soul awakens not by clinging to isolation, but by expanding into connection through love, service, creativity, and wonder. Every act of kindness, every moment of awe, every step towards self-awareness stitches us into the larger fabric of being. These are the actions that ensure continuity beyond death. They weave threads that no dissolution can erase. Strengthening the soul also means embracing practices that call us inward. Journaling, meditation, dream work, or therapy can all help us meet the depths of ourselves. Jung spoke of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are. This is not a luxury. It is the work of the soul. To ignore it is to risk hollow living. To embrace it is to leave behind an imprint that echoes beyond the grave. And finally, let us remember, to speak of the soulless is not to strip others of humanity, but to remind ourselves of responsibility. We cannot force anyone to awaken, but we can choose awakening for ourselves. We cannot save another from dissolution. We can ensure that our own lives carry meaning, depth, and continuity. The fate of the soulless is not simply their tragedy. It is our call to vigilance to cultivate the flame entrusted to us. When all is said and done, the ethical and spiritual lesson is both simple and profound. Guard your soul by living it. Refuse to become mechanical, refuse to stagnate, refuse to let life pass without growth. Every moment is an invitation to deepen, every challenge a chance to expand, every breath an opportunity to connect with the eternal. Death will come to all of us, but only those who have lived with soul will find that death is not an ending but a doorway. And so, as we prepare to close this journey, one question remains, not about them, the soulless, but about us. Are we living in such a way that our light will continue when the final breath leaves our body? The answer, whispered in the practices of the mystics, the insights of the psychologists, and the discoveries of science is the same. To live with soul is to live forever. We began this journey with a disturbing question. What happens to soulless beings when they die? Along the way, we walked through psychology, mysticism, science, and the voices of ancient traditions. Each perspective pointed us toward the same haunting truth. Without the soul's flame, death does not open into eternity, but into silence. For some, that silence may mean simple cessation. For others, fragmentation into astral debris. For still others, recycling back into the stream of existence without continuity of self. The common thread, however, was clear. Where there is no soul, there is no passage, no survival, no story that carries forward. Yet to linger only on the fate of the soulless would be to miss the deeper meaning of this exploration. The question has never been merely about them. It has always been about us. The images of emptiness we encountered in Jung's Hollow Man, Cayce's Soulless incarnations, the Gnostic empty vessels, or the Buddhist hungry ghosts serve as warnings. They remind us of what it looks like to live without depth, to move through life without ever touching the eternal within. These warnings are not here to inspire fear, but to stir vigilance. They whisper, do not sleepwalk through your own existence. Do not confuse the shell for the essence. Do not forget the fire you were entrusted with. The practical lesson, then, is simple yet profound. Stop speculating about whether others have souls and start nurturing your own. We may never know the full mystery of another person's inner life, and trying to categorize them risks sliding into judgment or projection. But we do know when our own light dims, when our own growth stalls, when we ourselves fall into repetition without transformation. That is where our attention must return. Nurturing the soul is not about dramatic gestures. It is about steady, daily acts of depth. It is about choosing honesty when falsehood would be easier, compassion when bitterness feels justified, growth when stagnation feels comfortable. It is about embracing pain as a teacher and joy as a reminder of the divine. It is about keeping your inner flame alive through practices that connect you to something greater, whether through prayer, meditation, creativity, service, or simply moments of awe beneath the night sky. Every choice that awakens you, every act that deepens you, is a step away from soullessness and a step toward eternity. If death without soul is dissolution, then death with soul is continuity. It is a passage into greater wholeness, a doorway rather than a wall. And that choice, whether we leave behind nothing or a resonance that endures, is being made moment by moment in the way we live today. The mystery of what happens after death may never be fully solved, but the mystery of how to live with soul is right here in front of us, waiting for our courage to answer. So as we close, let this be the final reflection. Ask not what happens to the soulless when they die, but what will happen to you when the time comes. Will your life leave only fragments, or will it leave an imprint that ripples through eternity? The answer is not written in the stars or sealed by fate. It is being written now, in the choices you make, in the growth you allow, in the love you give and receive. Awakening to this mystery does not mean living in fear. It means living awake, living deep, living with the quiet determination that your soul will not sleep through this one precious life. That is the power within your hands, and it is more than enough. For in the end, the only true tragedy is not death without soul. It is life without ever having lived.